Hi, we continue in 1 Samuel 17 today, where David is introduced both to Saul, apparently, and to readers for the third time. And so we're going to be looking at how the Septuagint does not have this passage that you can see in bold on the right side of the screen, and yet we'll read through it because most Bibles do have this, and then we'll look when we're finished with it at how the story is different, whether we include this part or skip it, and just use the non-bolded parts that are in the Septuagint, the shorter version. So as you can see here, the verse 12 here, starting with now David, picks up right here, and all this bold part is part of the Hebrew scripture part, the Masoretic text that we're going to use. But I want to note here that whoever inserted that and whenever it was written, it comes as a full stop from what we saw before. At the beginning, we saw the long introduction of Goliath with all his weapons and armor, and then we saw the question of what the Israelites were going to do when he came out to taunt them, and that was following the B part of the chiasm that we saw here. Now, as we looked at briefly last time, we'll go in more detail now. We're continuing here with this whole section, and this C section here, 12 to 30, is the part that's in the Hebrew scripture, the Masoretic text, but not in the Septuagint. 31 to 41 is in both. And so that's one of the reasons for the big jump, assuming scholars are right about a different authorship. It's certainly, there's no question of, but they're right that it's in the Hebrew Bible and not in the Septuagint. So that may be the reason for the full stop, although of course there are plenty of full stops when there's no question of different sources. But I want to highlight that here because it's placed in here, it interrupts and leaves a tension with Saul and all Israel being dismayed and afraid and what's going on. And it seems to take a step back. And one issue we have to look at is right here, looking at the fact that in the beginning of chapter 16, we saw the same three older brothers introduced by name as we are here, and a couple of other parallels, as you can see. David being referred to as the youngest, and the fact that he's keeping the sheep. So what do we make of that? If we read 17:12 to 15, and we've already read 16:5b to 11, as any reader of the Bible as we have it has, we might be wondering, why are we being told again about Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah? And another question that just can't be answered in either passage is, what about sons 4, 5, 6, and 7? We never hear a thing about them in either of these passages or anywhere else. But this is certainly what leads many scholars to wonder about there being some kind of parallel between them that indicates different sources from a different time. And there are other parts in this section, as we'll see later here at the very end of the chapter. It's going to be as if Saul doesn't even know who the young man is. He'll ask Abner, his commander of the army, whose son is this young man? And Abner will say, as your soul lives, O king, I do not know. Right after he's already defeated Goliath and the whole scene that we're beginning to unfold here. So there are definitely some more questions about that, and we'll look at that more as we go. I want to situate us also in the sense of the Atlas here, because as we've been looking at the Philistines gathered at Soko here, and David is, we're going to be told in a minute, is going back and forth between Bethlehem and here. And so we're going to look at that in just a minute here. Now, David was the son of an Ephrathite. We hadn't heard that before. We'd heard that, that Jesse was of Bethlehem. Ephrathite is a detail that doesn't make it a tribal member. As we saw earlier, Ephra is another name for Bethlehem. So this is oddly, actually a strange phrase. It's saying like an Angelino from Los Angeles or something like that. That's not quite it, because you'd have to have two different names, but two different names of the same place. As is noted from Halpern below, this reference, not a son of a Judahite, reflects the fact that there was no tribe of Judah at the time of David's birth. But Judah was also already mentioned in this chapter as submitting some of the troops for arranging the battle lines, although Saul does not have any relationship with them. We're going to only see about Israel referenced there. So if we were only reading this without chapter 16, this would all be new information, but we already knew that before. But Bethlehem being in Judah is an interesting question here. If there was no Judah at the time, as the note from Halpern suggests, then why is the narrator here putting Bethlehem in Judah before David has made Judah a place? And so that's a question we're just going to have to grapple with as we go. Notice that Bethlehem is just a little south of Jerusalem, which isn't Jerusalem yet, it's Jebus, until David takes it from the Jebusites and it becomes Jerusalem. So we're in that area, which is certainly Judah, but maybe not Judah yet in the time of the story. So we were told he had 8 sons. We weren't told that in the parallel. We were told he had 7 sons, and yet there was a surprise raised when Samuel asked, is that all? And he said, well, there's still the youngest one, or the smallest one. So then we get this odd phrase at the end of the verse. In the days of Saul the man, presumably Jesse, was already old and advanced in years. The phrase old and advanced in years is a standard biblical figure of speech. We hear it for people like Abraham and others. But there's an ambiguity here that's really deep when we think about it. The days of Saul, when does that mean? Saul reigned for many, many years. We've already seen him in a number of chapters, and it's not clear how much time has gone by, but certainly years have gone by, and there'll be many more years as he and David fight it out for who's going to be the king. So if Jesse is already old now, which is to say at this moment in the story, then maybe he wouldn't live that much longer, but this could refer to any period. And why does Jesse's age matter? The only reason I can think of, and some scholars suggest this, is what we're being presented here as between Jesse and Saul and David, especially in the description we'll see in verse 15, is that this is competition for who David's father is. Plainly, Saul is not going to be his literal father, but he's going to refer to him in parental terms in a number of times as we go. And so will David be loyal to his father, biological father, Jesse, or his political, ethnic, and perhaps military father, Saul? And we're going to see the difference because we're going to hear about the three sons following Saul in a moment. So we hear the three eldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle. Notice that's different than what the Israelites were. They had all gathered there in the place. But this is suggesting that three eldest sons are members of Saul's entourage, that they've left their father and have followed Saul. And we don't see them go home like we see David go back and forth. And we see their three names. Eliab named here as the firstborn, Bakor, only here and earlier in 8:2 in 1 Samuel, and then we'll see it in 2 Samuel in another context. And there's nothing else said about these. And why they're named, who knows? And why the others are not named, who knows? Because in this part of the story, they play no role at all. In the earlier part, at least Samuel had to look at them and decide if they were the ones that Yahweh picked to be the Messiah. And here they have no part at all. Although they will have a little part later, as we'll see when they speak to David angrily. So David is the youngest, and we're repeated here, the three eldest followed Saul, which makes a little chiasm here. We see the phrase, the three eldest sons of Jesse followed Saul, and we see that repeated here, and then David is the youngest in the center there. So really emphasizing that they have left their father and are following Saul. But as we see in verse 15, David, at least symbolically, is going back and forth. David went back and forth here, halak bashav, shav to return, and we'll see, ironically, let's look at that now in 757, where we see another return after he returned from killing the Philistine. So he'll return here from Saul, and he'll return later from killing the Philistine. So the phrase from Saul here, notice that it doesn't say that David is going to the battle lines or to the other troops, but literally between the two fathers here, that he's going back and forth between Jesse and Saul to feed his father's sheep. Notice the emphasis on his father's sheep, not his sheep or his family sheep, but the father's sheep, highlighting that distance there. Note if we look at this map from Google Maps, it's 27 kilometers between the two places. And certainly people who are active in the world before cars, etc., and certainly an active person who's a shepherd would be strong and could walk 3 or 4 miles an hour, at least 3, but probably 4 miles an hour. So if we translate that as Google Maps does for us, that's like 4 or 5 hours each way, every day. It doesn't say every day, but we presume that he's going back and forth regularly. So that's a long distance to be going back and forth here between Soko and Bethlehem, as you can see on the Google Maps. So for 40 days, the Philistine came forward. And a couple of things there. The 40 days, it refers back to Numbers 13:31. Let's look at that here. We are not able to go up against these people, for they are stronger than us, which is to say 40 days where they're out against giant people. Here, the Nephilim connecting back to Genesis 6, a story we've looked at in our Genesis series we don't need to look at now. The phrase 40 days is 22 times in the Masoretic text, but most of the times refer to the Exodus story or the flood story. This is the only time it's used in Samuel and one time in 1 Kings, apart from references in Deuteronomy to the Exodus. So certainly the authors here understand that 40 days is a proverbial period for a long period of time in which people are doing something. And what we can imagine here is that while David is going back and forth between Saul and his father Jesse, the Philistine is going back and forth between his people and taking the stand, taunting at them. The phrase for taking a stand here, tseb here, is used several times we see, and it's both literally standing, but it's of course also the confrontation element. The word for morning here is an unusual word. The normal word for morning, boker, which is the one we hear in Genesis, morning and evening, and it's 213 times in the Masoretic text. This is Shechem, which is the same visually as the verb the noun Shechem with the vowels in it, which means shoulder, and is also a place and the people of that place in Genesis 34. We'll see much later whether Shechem has a role here, but it's hidden behind the translation here. So shoulder and evening here, really, it's a euphemism for the shoulder of the day, if you will. So that doesn't make much of a euphemism for me to suggest morning, but maybe it did for them. So with that introduction, now we get a word from Jesse, and my note below highlights that there's no narrative bridge to connect this here. We saw that the people are out there and that David is going back and forth, but now Jesse says to his son David something that seems to have nothing to do with the battle at all. Take for your brother an ephah of this parched grain and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp to your brothers, and also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000. See how your brothers fare and bring some token from them. Let's look at that in some detail. So literally, take please here. The verb for take is the same verb for what kings do, but Jesse's not a king, and he's asking. So it's his son. He could command him, but there's a please that the translation almost always leaves out. So take for your brothers this food, and notice how that's similar to the sending of Joseph to his brothers in Genesis 37. David is very different than Joseph, but there are many connections between 1st and 2nd Samuel and Genesis, and we'll see more of those as we go. But certainly one of the connections is the youngest son is going to be more powerful and important, both politically and socially, than the older brothers, and there'll be jealousy among them. So take this grain and these loaves and carry them quickly, literally, and run to the camp to your brothers. What's Jesse's hurry here? If they've been going for 40 days and 40 nights, there must be some scheme in which their food is being provided, and certainly we don't need to expect that each soldier is provided food from their own family, wherever they might be from. We don't know anything else about food or provisions here. We just got this close-up of the camera, if you will, on Jesse sending it. So just curiously, and from the Hebrew, the phrase for cheeses is literally slices of milk, and the word karitz here is only here in the Hebrew scripture. One of a number of places I've been pointing out already, and we'll see more as we go, of words that are either unique to this chapter or almost unique, an element of which leads scholars to think that this is from a different source and a later source using vocabulary that wasn't familiar to the earlier writers. Of course, the sending it to the commander of their 1,000, which would in the Roman world would be a chiliarch, and we see those in the New Testament here at Laser Ha-Aleph here. But it does imply they're part of the army. The 3 brothers, having followed Saul, are already serving in the army, and so this is support not only for the commander, obviously, but 10 wheels of cheese would be for their troops as well. So he's trying to suggest that he's in favor of this and supporting his family in the war. And looking for their shalom here. So shalom is used a number of times. If you're not familiar with the very important Hebrew word shalom, it can be both the ordinary greeting, hello and goodbye, but it can also mean peace and harmony, both in terms of internal harmony of a person, that their mind and spirit and body are all working together, but also social harmony. And we've seen it several times already in 1 Samuel, as my note shows. And the phrase bring some token from them, Fackelman suggests could be a confirmation of both their health amidst the fighting, and it can refer to both a physical object or verbal reassurance. So the token can be bringing something from them or just a word that they're okay. Because certainly the old man, and perhaps that's the reason we're told it's an old man, isn't going to easily go back and forth between Bethlehem and Soko, sends his young virile son to go do that. And so let's look down just a little more to see our last 2 verses for this video. So now we return to Saul. Notice how the camera has gone back and forth between the battle lines and then back to Bethlehem, and now David comes and we're back with Saul before David leaves. So going back and forth for us here. So and my note below says, suggesting that the battle is raging on amid Goliath's taunting, which is a surprise here, that they're fighting with the Philistines. Everything we'd read so far in this chapter suggested the battle was awaiting the Israelites to send somebody to engage in single combat with the Philistine, with Goliath. But they're still waiting for that person. Goliath has been taunting them for 40 days, and yet now we're told to our surprise that there's already a warfare going on, which leads to a real question of what the single combat is about if there's already fighting amongst the troops. But the text doesn't seem worried about that, as we'll see what happens after the battle between David and Goliath is over. And so David rose early in the morning, a phrase for a number of things early in the morning. We see it here in 1 Samuel, and we'll see it again a couple of times, 30 times in the Masoretic text for rising early. And of course, rising early is to say before the heat of the day, in a place where most of the year it would be warm. So he left the sheep here, as David leaves the baggage in verse 22, and just we'll see that next video, recalling Saul hiding amongst the baggage with a keeper here, a shomer, and took the provisions, which is the word, the noun nis here, which underscores the more generic nature of the term translated as shield bearer, both at 17:7 and 17:41. I noted at 17:7, it could just be the one who carries the stuff, a baggage assistant, and this makes clear that that's what's at issue. So the keeper of the sheep, and that David took the provisions, which are to say the grain and the cheese, and went as Jesse had commanded him. This is the introduction of a theme that we're going to see a number of times where there are a lot of assistants and other people around. It's not surprising there'd be an assistant to a keeper of the sheep, but we'll see a number of messengers and other officials, and that will be important in terms of who knows what, because there'll be a number of secret messages going back and forth throughout these books, and whether these other messengers know them or not, and whether they're reliable messengers will be a real question. So the text is beginning to be populated with a second level of characters behind the major named characters. And he came to the encampment, a rare word here, given the commonality of words for camp and ranks and battle lines and all those things. This is a different word here. And the army was going forth to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And so that's the scene as we have it here. David simply being sent to bring food to his brothers, and yet when he gets there, there's a battle going on. And we'll see what the young shepherd boy thinks about the battle. He's certainly not going to be focused on the bread and the cheese. See you next.